firefighter Luke Carter trudged up the snow-covered trail, his boots crunching through the icy terrain, the biting wind howling through the trees. He had planned this weekend hike as a reprieve from the chaos of work, just the fresh air, the towering pines, and the silence of the wilderness. But as he rounded a sharp bend in the trail, the silence was broken by a faint, desperate whimper. Luke stopped in his tracks, straining to locate the source of the sound. His sharp eyes scanned the snowy expanse ahead until they landed on a mound of dark fur partially buried in the snow, blending almost seamlessly with the rocky terrain. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light or a fallen tree branch. But then it moved, a weak, jerking motion, and another heart-wrenching whimper followed. He approached cautiously, his breath fogging in the cold air. The closer he got, the more apparent it became that it was a dog, a German shepherd, lying prone in the snow, its body trembling from either pain, cold, or both. The dog's leg was grotesquely swollen, its fur matted with blood, and deep, jagged claw marks marred its flank. Luke's stomach twisted as he realized the animal had likely survived a mountain lion attack. Its chest heaved with shallow breaths, each one in evident struggle. "Easy there, buddy," Luke murmured, crouching down a few feet away, his hands held up in a non-threatening gesture. The dog's amber eyes cracked open, locking onto his, filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Its lips curled back weakly, revealing teeth that were more a warning than a threat. Luke took a slow step forward, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm here to help, okay? You're not alone." The dog didn't move, but its growl faded into a pitiful whine. Its fur was speckled with frost, and blood from its wounds had stained the snow beneath it a stark crimson. Luke's heart sank at the sight. He knew the dog wouldn't last much longer in the freezing temperatures without intervention. Kneeling beside the animal, Luke took off his gloves and reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing against its icy fur. The dog flinched but didn't resist further. Its strength was clearly spent. Luke could feel the tremors rippling through its body, the shallow rise and fall of its ribcage beneath his palm. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He assessed the injuries more closely. The claw marks on the dog's flank were deep and oozing, likely infected. Its back leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the swelling suggesting a serious fracture. The poor creature was emaciated, its ribs jutting out beneath its thick coat, and Luke guessed it had been on its own for a while before the attack. He removed his jacket and draped it carefully over the dog, trying to provide some warmth. The animal let out a soft, almost grateful sigh, its eyes slipping closed again. Luke knew he needed to act fast. Out here in the wilderness, there were no easy options for medical help, and the nearest trailhead was at least 2 miles away. "All right, big guy," he said, pulling out his phone to check for a signal. Nothing. He shoved it back into his pocket with a grimace. "Looks like it's just you and me." He unzipped his backpack and rummaged through it for anything that might help. A small first aid kit, a bottle of water, and an old t-shirt would have to do for now. He tore the shirt into strips and used them to bind the worst of the wounds, doing his best to stop the bleeding. The dog whimpered softly but didn't resist, its energy too depleted to fight him. After securing the makeshift bandages, Luke tipped the water bottle to the dog's muzzle. At first, it didn't respond, but after a few drops trickled onto its tongue, it began to lap weakly. "That's it," Luke encouraged. "Stay with me." He worked quickly, knowing that time was against them. He fashioned a crude sling out of his backpack straps and the remaining pieces of the shirt, carefully sliding it under the dog's body. Lifting the animal was no easy task. It was heavier than it looked, and its injuries made every movement precarious. The dog whimpered in pain as Luke hoisted it into his arms, its head lolling against his chest. "Sorry, buddy," he said, his voice strained from the effort. "I know it hurts, but we've got to get you out of here." The trek back down the trail was grueling. The uneven terrain and thick snow made every step treacherous, and the added weight of the dog tested Luke's endurance. His muscles burned, and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. The dog lay limp in his arms, its shallow breathing the only sign of life. As he trudged forward, the wilderness around him seemed to close in, the towering trees casting long, eerie shadows in the fading light. The wind picked up, biting at his exposed skin and howling through the branches like a mournful wail. Luke's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if the mountain lion was still nearby? What if the dog went into shock before they made it to safety? But he pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of his steps and the fragile weight in his arms. He couldn't let the dog die out here, not after everything it had already endured. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trailhead came into view. His truck was parked just beyond it, a welcome sight against the stark white backdrop of the snow-covered landscape. Summoning the last reserves of his strength, Luke carried the dog to the vehicle and gently laid it on the back seat, wrapping it snugly in his jacket. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, cranking up the heat as he glanced back at the dog. Its eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting his gaze with a flicker of trust before closing again. "You're safe now," Luke said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got you." With that, he pulled out onto the icy road, determination hardening his features. He didn't know what awaited them at the end of the drive, but one thing was certain: he wasn't about to let this dog's story end in the snow. The cold was merciless, the kind that sliced straight through the skin and gnawed at the bones. Luke Carter stood over the injured German shepherd, its blood staining the pristine snow around it. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the bitter cold and the raw effort it took to keep moving. The wind lashed at his face, tearing tears from his eyes. He rubbed his numb hands together, his breath fogging in short bursts as he scanned the forest around him for anything he could use. The dog's shallow breathing was uneven, the rise and fall of its chest a grim reminder of how little time they had. Luke had no phone signal to call for help, and the meager supplies in his pack, a water bottle, a pocket knife, and a few energy bars, were laughable in the face of what needed to be done. The truck was miles away, far down a winding trail that felt endless in the bitter cold. There was no choice but to act, and fast. "Hang in there, buddy," Luke muttered, crouching down beside the animal. The dog flinched as he reached out to adjust the jacket he'd wrapped around it, a faint growl rumbling in its throat. But it lacked the strength to resist. Luke's heart squeezed painfully. He didn't just see an injured animal, he saw a survivor, one who had fought with everything it had against impossible odds, only to be left on the brink of death. "I think," Luke whispered to himself, his voice hoarse. His gaze darted to the dense forest around him. A plan began to form, though it was desperate and flimsy. He had to move the dog. It couldn't walk, not with that shattered leg and the gaping wounds along its flank. Carrying it all the way to the truck wasn't an option either. He'd barely managed the few steps earlier without collapsing. That left one option: building something to drag it on. Luke set to work, his hands fumbling with the branches scattered along the forest floor. His fingers, stiff with cold, struggled to snap off smaller twigs and strip the limbs down to their barest form. The wind howled through the trees, mocking his every move, and the snow soaked through his knees as he knelt in the freezing slush. "This is insane," he muttered, biting his lips so hard it nearly bled. But there was no room for doubt, no time for self-pity. He grabbed a fallen branch, testing its strength as he tried to lash it to another with his belt. His movements were jerky and frantic, driven by adrenaline and fear. Behind him, the dog let out a low, pained whimper that made Luke freeze. He turned, his heart hammering in his chest. The animal's eyes were open, glassy with exhaustion and suffering, but they locked onto his. It wasn't just pain in those eyes, it was trust, fragile and unspoken. "I'm not leaving you," Luke said firmly, his voice cracking. He didn't care that no one was around to hear him or that the wind swallowed his words. He needed to say it, if only for himself. It took longer than he wanted. Every knot, every twist of fabric felt like a battle against the elements. He ripped his jacket, turning it into a crude sling to cradle the dog's broken body. The branches formed the base of a sled, the jagged ends tied together with the remnants of his shirt and the straps of his backpack. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't stable, but it would have to do. When it was finally done, Luke knelt by the dog again. "This is gonna hurt," he warned softly, his voice heavy with regret. "But we've gotta do this, okay?" Carefully, he slid his hands under the dog, his arms trembling as he lifted its limp form. The animal whimpered, a sound so broken that it felt like a knife twisting in Luke's gut. He placed it gently onto the sled, adjusting the jacket to keep it as warm as possible. The dog's breathing was labored, its body barely stirring, but it didn't resist. Luke straightened, his breath coming in sharp gasps. His body ached, every muscle protesting as he grabbed the makeshift reins, a bundle of rope and fabric tied to the sled. He glanced back at the dog one last time, as if seeking permission. Its eyes were closed, but the faint rise and fall of its chest told him it was still holding on. "Let's go," Luke said, his voice low but determined. The first step was the hardest. The sled barely moved, the branches catching on the uneven ground and the deep snow. Luke gritted his teeth, planting his boots firmly as he leaned into the straps, pulling with everything he had. His legs burned, his back screamed in protest, but the sled began to slide forward inch by inch. The trail was unforgiving. Every branch that snagged the sled, every patch of ice that made his boots slip, felt like an insult. The wind was relentless, driving snow into his eyes and numbing his face. His gloves were soaked through, and his fingers felt like they were turning to ice. He stumbled more times than he could count, each fall sending him face first into the snow, but he didn't stop. There were moments when he wanted to collapse, to scream into the empty forest and give up. But every time those thoughts crept in, he glanced back at the dog, who was still alive. Barely, but alive. That fragile thread of life was enough to keep him moving. Hours passed, though they felt like days. Luke's body moved on autopilot, his mind numb to everything but the desperate need to keep going. He lost track of how many times he had to stop and adjust the sled, how many times he whispered words of encouragement to the unconscious dog. Almost there, he muttered through chattering teeth, though he didn't know if it was true. The truck could still be miles away. His muscles felt like they were tearing apart, his vision blurring from exhaustion and the freezing wind. His pride was gone, stripped away with every humiliating stumble and every desperate pull of the sled. When the truck finally came into view, it didn't feel real. Luke stopped in his tracks, blinking through the snow as if it were a mirage. But the familiar shape of his vehicle was unmistakable. A strangled laugh escaped his lips, followed by a sob that he couldn't suppress. "Hold on," he said to the dog, his voice shaking. With renewed energy, or perhaps just sheer desperation, he dragged the sled the final stretch to the truck. He collapsed to his knees beside it, his hands fumbling with the door as he worked to lift the dog into the back seat. It took every ounce of strength he had left to climb into the driver's seat. His fingers, trembling and stiff, turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. Warm air blasted from the vents, a stark contrast to the icy hell he'd endured. Luke glanced back at the dog, now curled on the seat beneath layers of fabric. Its eyes fluttered open for a moment, meeting his gaze. "You're safe now," Luke whispered, his voice raw. He didn't know if it was true, not yet. But for the first time that day, hope flickered in his chest. With that, he pressed the accelerator and headed down the icy road, the storm raging behind them. The roar of the truck's engine faded as Luke Carter parked in front of his modest home, a secluded cabin nestled on the outskirts of the forest. Snow blanketed the property, reflecting the moonlight in a cold, sterile glow. His muscles screamed in protest as he stepped out of the truck and moved to the back seat, where the injured German shepherd lay motionless. The dog's breathing was faint but steady, its body wrapped in the remnants of Luke's jacket. "Almost there, buddy," he muttered, though his voice was hoarse and trembling. He knew the night was far from over. The real battle was just beginning. Gently, he slid his arms under the dog and lifted it, his boots crunching over the frozen ground as he carried the animal toward the barn. The cabin itself was small, barely big enough for Luke and his belongings, but the barn offered space to treat the dog without overwhelming the fragile creature further. The thought of bringing it inside, where the warmth of the wood-burning stove could help, lingered in his mind. But if the dog panicked, injured as it was, it could hurt itself, or him. For now, the barn was safer. He nudged the barn door open with his shoulder, stepping into the dim interior. The familiar scent of hay and wood filled his nostrils, mingling with the faint metallic tang of blood from the dog. He set it down gently on a pile of old blankets he'd hastily gathered earlier, his hands trembling as he adjusted the makeshift bedding. The dog whimpered softly but didn't resist. Luke exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the frigid air. He grabbed a flashlight from the nearby workbench and directed the beam over the animal's wounds. The sight was grim. The deep claw marks along its flank were crusted with dried blood, the swollen leg bent at a sickening angle. He couldn't afford to wait for help, not out here where the nearest vet was miles away and unreachable until morning. "You're one tough son of a gun," Luke said, forcing a smile he didn't feel. The dog's ears twitched slightly at his voice, a faint acknowledgement that filled him with a sliver of hope. Luke worked quickly, his firefighter training kicking in. He boiled water on a portable camping stove to sterilize his equipment, a pair of scissors, gauze, and some antiseptic he kept in his first aid kit. As the water bubbled, he cleaned his hands as best he could, biting back the exhaustion threatening to pull him under. "This is gonna hurt," he murmured as he knelt beside the dog, carefully snipping away matted fur around the wounds. The animal flinched, its teeth baring briefly in pain, but it didn't snap at him. I know. Just hold on." Every movement was painstakingly slow. He cleaned the wounds with warm water, the antiseptic stinging as it seeped into the torn flesh. The dog whined pitifully, and Luke had to pause several times, his heart clenching at the sound. He hated this, hated the helplessness of seeing a creature suffer and knowing he could only do so much. The humiliation of his limited resources weighed on him like a stone. A real vet would have had proper tools, proper medicine. All Luke had were his hands, his grit, and his determination. After what felt like hours, he splinted the broken leg with 2 straight pieces of wood and secured it with strips of fabric. It was crude and makeshift, but it would hold until he could get the dog to a professional. By the time he was done, sweat dripped down his face despite the cold, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He sat back on his heels, running a hand through his damp hair. "There," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not perfect, but it'll do for now." The dog's eyes fluttered open, locking onto his with a mixture of exhaustion and something that almost looked like gratitude. Luke felt a lump rise in his throat. "You're a fighter," he said, his voice cracking. "You'll pull through." As he stood to gather more supplies, the barn door creaked open behind him, letting in a gust of icy wind. Luke turned sharply, his flashlight beam illuminating the wiry figure of Carl Mitchell, a local hunter with a reputation for being as sharp-tongued as he was trigger-happy. Carl stepped inside, his boots leaving muddy prints on the barn floor. His rifle was slung over one shoulder, and his weathered face was set in a scowl. "What in the hell are you doing, Carter?" he demanded, his voice rough. "You know stray dogs are nothing but trouble. That thing's probably feral." Luke stiffened, his exhaustion giving way to irritation. "It's not feral. It's injured. I'm helping it." Carl scoffed, his breath clouding in the cold air. "You're wasting your time. Strays like that are dangerous. You should have left it where you found it." The words hit Luke like a slap, stoking a fire in his chest. He stepped forward, his shoulders squared. "It was dying," he said firmly. "I couldn't just walk away." Carl's eyes narrowed, his hand resting on the strap of his rifle. "You've got a good heart, Carter, I'll give you that. But you're being stupid. That dog could turn on you the second it gets its strength back. And don't forget, there's a mountain lion prowling around these parts. You're risking more than just yourself by keeping it here." Luke's jaw tightened. He knew Carl wasn't entirely wrong. The mountain lion was a very real threat. He'd seen the claw marks on the dog's body, the signs of a fight for survival. But the idea of abandoning the animal now, after everything, was unthinkable. "I'm not abandoning it," Luke said, his voice low but steady. "Not now. Not ever." Carl shook his head, his expression darkening. "You think you're doing the right thing, but you're not. That dog's not your responsibility." "Well, it is now," Luke snapped, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "So unless you're here to help, get the hell out of my barn." For a moment, silence hung heavy between them, the only sound the faint whistling of the wind outside. Carl stared at Luke, his jaw working as if he wanted to argue. But then he shrugged, the motion almost dismissive. "Suit yourself," he said, his tone laced with disdain. "But don't come crying to me when it all goes wrong." With that, he turned and walked out, the barn door slamming shut behind him. Luke stood there, his fists clenched at his sides, his breath ragged. He wanted to yell, to let out the frustration and anger boiling inside him. But there was no time for that. He turned back to the dog, its fragile body barely rising and falling with each breath. "Don't listen to him," Luke said softly, kneeling beside it once more. "You're not dangerous. You're just a survivor." He stayed with the dog for hours, checking its breathing, adjusting the blankets to keep it warm. The barn was cold, and the wind outside was relentless, but Luke didn't care. This wasn't just about saving an animal, it was about refusing to give up, no matter how hard or humiliating the circumstances. As the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the barn walls, Luke finally allowed himself to sit back, his body sagging with exhaustion. The dog was still alive, its chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. It wasn't much, but it was enough. "You're gonna make it," Luke whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We both will." The engine coughed once, twice, and then fell silent. Luke slammed his palm against the steering wheel, the sting of cold metal biting into his gloved hand. "Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth, twisting the key in the ignition again. The truck gave another feeble groan before dying completely, its refusal final. Luke let out a shaky breath, his heart sinking. He'd been so close, only a few more miles to the animal rescue shelter where the German Shepherd could get the proper care it needed. Instead, he was stranded in the middle of nowhere, the snow piling up around him as if nature itself was conspiring against him. The injured dog lay in the back seat, its body wrapped in blankets to ward off the biting cold. Its breathing was shallow but steady, the occasional whimper escaping its muzzle. Luke turned to look at it, his frustration melting into determination. He wasn't going to let this be the end of the line, not for the dog and not for himself. "All right, buddy," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "Looks like we're doing this the hard way." He stepped out of the truck, the icy wind slicing through his coat like a knife. The snow was deeper than he'd realized, crunching under his boots as he made his way to the back door. He opened it carefully, his hands trembling as he lifted the dog into his arms. It let out a soft whine but didn't resist, too weak to do anything but trust him. Luke whistled sharply, the sound cutting through the silence of the woods. A moment later, a blur of black and white fur emerged from the trees, bounding toward him with unwavering loyalty. Daisy, his border collie, skidded to a stop at his feet, her tongue lolling out as she looked up at him expectantly. "Good girl," Luke murmured, scratching her behind the ears. "We've got a long walk ahead of us, but I need you to stay sharp, okay?" Daisy barked once in response, her tail wagging despite the cold. Luke adjusted the dog in his arms, the weight a reminder of the miles they had yet to cover. With a deep breath, he set off, his boots crunching through the snow as Daisy trotted beside him. The trail was treacherous, the snow falling in heavy drifts that obscured the path. Every step was a struggle, the weight of the dog and the biting wind making each moment feel like a test of his endurance. His muscles burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pushed forward, refusing to give in to the cold or the exhaustion clawing at his limbs. But the woods were eerily silent, the usual sounds of wildlife swallowed by the oppressive blanket of snow. It wasn't long before Luke felt the prickle of unease crawling up his spine, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Daisy's low growl confirmed what he already suspected. Luke stopped in his tracks, his eyes scanning the dense trees around them. The silence was deafening, the kind that only came when something, or someone, was hunting. He tightened his grip on the dog, his heart pounding in his chest as he reached for the pistol holstered at his hip. A flicker of movement caught his eye, a shadow slipping between the trees, too large and deliberate to be anything but the mountain lion. "Daisy, stay close," Luke hissed, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own breathing. The border collie crouched low, her ears pinned back as she bared her teeth in the direction of the movement. The mountain lion stepped into view, its golden eyes locking onto Luke with predatory intent. It was massive, its lean, muscular frame a stark contrast to the fragile creature in his arms. The claw marks on the dog's flank flashed in his mind, a brutal reminder of what this animal was capable of. Easy, Luke muttered, his voice steady despite the panic surging through him. He shifted the dog in his arms, freeing one hand to draw his pistol. The cold metal felt heavy in his grip, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical force. The mountain lion crouched, its tail flicking back and forth as it prepared to pounce. Luke's finger hovered over the trigger, his breath frozen in his lungs. Daisy growled louder, inching forward as if ready to throw herself between him and the predator. "Don't even think about it," Luke muttered under his breath, his voice sharp. The lion leapt. Luke fired a warning shot into the air, the crack of the gun reverberating through the woods. The sound startled the lion, its leap faltering as it landed a few feet away, its eyes narrowing in fury. Daisy barked furiously, darting around the lion in a flurry of motion to draw its attention. The predator hesitated, torn between the barking dog and the man standing firm with the pistol. "Get back!" Luke shouted, his voice ringing with authority. He fired another shot into the ground near the lion's feet, the snow exploding in a spray of white. The mountain lion snarled, its ears flattening against its head as it backed away slowly. Daisy continued to bark, her movements sharp and calculated as she kept the predator's focus on her. Luke held his ground, his body tense as he stared down the animal. Finally, with a frustrated growl, the lion turned and slinked back into the trees, its golden eyes disappearing into the shadows. Luke let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he lowered the pistol. He glanced down at Daisy, who trotted back to him with her tail wagging, her tongue lolling out in a triumphant grin. "Good girl," he said, his voice thick with relief. He reached down to scratch her behind the ears, his other hand clutching the dog in his arms tightly. "We're not out of this yet, but you just bought us some time." The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him weak and shaky as he resumed his trek. Every step felt heavier than the last, his legs burning with the effort of trudging through the snow. Daisy stayed close, her ears swiveling as she remained on high alert. The shelter was still miles away, but Luke refused to let himself think about the distance. All that mattered was putting one foot in front of the other, keeping the dog safe, and staying ahead of the predator lurking in the woods. By the time the sun began to rise, casting a pale golden light over the snow, Luke's body was on the verge of collapse. But the sight of the rescue shelter's roof peeking through the trees filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. "We made it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The dog let out a soft whimper, as if acknowledging the words. Luke stumbled into the shelter's clearing, his knees nearly buckling as he approached the door. Daisy barked once, her tail wagging as she pressed against his leg. "We're here," Luke said, his voice cracking with emotion. "We're finally here." The door to the rescue shelter creaked open, and Luke stumbled inside, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stay upright. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, the icy wind from outside following him like an unwelcome ghost. He clutched the injured German shepherd tightly in his arms, refusing to let go even as his body threatened to collapse under the strain. Behind him, Daisy padded in, her fur dusted with snow, her tail wagging as if to say, "We did it." The warmth of the shelter hit him like a tidal wave, the contrast to the freezing outdoors almost overwhelming. The soft hum of heaters filled the air, and the smell of antiseptics mingled with the faint aroma of wet fur. A woman in her late 30s, wearing scrubs under a heavy fleece jacket, looked up from her desk, her expression shifting from mild surprise to alarm the moment she saw him. "Dear God, what happened?" she exclaimed, rushing toward him. Luke barely managed to rasp out, "Dog, injured. Mountain lion attack." His knees buckled, and he sank to the floor, still cradling the German shepherd. The woman crouched beside him, her hands gentle but firm as she examined the dog. "You're both frozen," she said, her tone urgent but calm. "Come on, let's get the dog on the table." Luke nodded numbly, allowing her to guide him toward the nearest examination room. His arms felt like they were made of lead as he gently laid the dog down on the padded table. It let out a soft whimper, its eyes half closed, its chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The woman, who introduced herself as Emma, immediately went to work. She checked the dog's pulse, carefully unwrapped Luke's makeshift bandages, and inspected the wounds with a critical eye. Her hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had done this countless times before, but her face betrayed her concern. "This poor thing has been through hell," she muttered, more to herself than to Luke. "Deep lacerations, severe dehydration, and that leg, definitely fractured. But it's alive, and that's a damn miracle." Luke leaned against the wall, his body sagging with exhaustion. Will it make it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Emma looked up at him, her expression softening. "Yes," she said firmly. "With proper care, it'll recover. The wounds will heal, and the leg will mend. But it's going to take time." Luke exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders slumping with relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, the crushing weight of fear began to lift. The dog was going to be okay. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. Emma gave him a small smile. "Thank you for getting it here. From the looks of it, you went through quite an ordeal yourself. Why don't you sit down? You look like you're about to pass out." Luke shook his head. "I'm fine," he said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. His hands were trembling, and his legs felt like jelly, but he couldn't bring himself to rest. Not yet. He watched as Emma cleaned the dog's wounds, her movements efficient and unflinching. It reminded him of how he'd treated burns and injuries in the field, focused, methodical, with no room for error. As he stood there, the events of the past day played out in his mind like a fever dream. The mountain lion's golden eyes flashing in the darkness, the suffocating cold of the snowstorm, the endless miles he trudged with the dog in his arms. He could still feel the sting of humiliation from Carl's harsh words, the doubt they had planted in his mind. But now, looking at the dog on the table, alive and fighting, he felt a spark of something stronger: pride. "You know," Emma said as she worked, "a lot of people wouldn't have done what you did. Most would have left the dog there, figuring it wasn't worth the risk. But you carried it all this way. Through snow, through God knows what else." Luke shrugged, his throat tight. "I couldn't just leave it. It wouldn't have survived." Emma glanced at him, her gaze piercing. "No, it wouldn't have. And neither would most people in your situation. You're tougher than you think." Her words made him feel exposed, like she could see right through him to the raw, vulnerable parts he tried to keep hidden. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenching at his sides. "It wasn't about being tough," he said, his voice low. "It was about doing the right thing. It just felt like I had to." Emma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Well, whatever the reason, this dog owes its life to you. And that's not something to take lightly." Luke looked at the German Shepherd, its chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. Despite the bandages and the splint on its leg, it looked peaceful, almost content. He felt a strange pang in his chest, a mix of relief, pride, and something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. "It wasn't just me," he said after a moment. "Daisy helped too. She kept us both safe." He glanced down at his border collie, who was lying at his feet, her head resting on her paws. Her ears perked up at the sound of her name, and her tail wagged slightly. Emma smiled. "She's a good dog. A lot like her owner, I'd bet." Luke didn't respond, but the corners of his mouth twitched upward in a faint smile. He reached down to scratch Daisy behind the ears, his fingers brushing through her thick fur. She looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, and for a moment, the exhaustion and the cold seemed to melt away. As Emma continued to work, Luke found himself reflecting on everything that had led him here. The German Shepherd had been a stranger to him, just another injured animal in need of help. But somewhere along the way, through the struggle, the fear, and the pain, it had become something more. A symbol, maybe, of resilience, of hope, of the simple, undeniable fact that life was worth fighting for, no matter how hard or hopeless it seemed. He thought about the way the dog had looked at him during their journey, its amber eyes filled with trust despite the pain it was in. It had reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten, what it meant to care for something outside of himself. To give everything he had, even when he thought he had nothing left. "You've got a bond with this dog," Emma said, breaking the silence. "It's rare, you know. That kind of connection." Luke looked at her, surprised. "I barely know it." Emma smiled knowingly. "Doesn't matter. Sometimes it's not about how long you've known someone, or something. It's about what you've been through together. Luke swallowed hard, his throat thick with emotion. He didn't have the words to respond, so he simply nodded. The truth of her statement settled over him like a warm blanket, soothing the raw edges of his exhaustion. As Emma finished bandaging the dog's wounds and carefully lifted it into a large, padded kennel for rest, Luke felt a strange sense of closure. The battle wasn't over, the dog still had a long road to recovery, but for the first time in days he felt like they'd won something. Like they'd defied the odds and come out the other side stronger for it. "Thank you," he said again, his voice quiet but sincere. "For everything." Emma waved a hand dismissively. "Just doing my job. You're the real hero here." Luke glanced at the German Shepherd one last time, its eyes closed, its breathing steady. He knew he'd be back to check on it, to see it through its recovery. But for now, he had Daisy by his side and a heart full of lessons learned. The drive back home was silent, except for the rhythmic hum of the tires against the snow-packed road. Luke Carter kept one hand on the steering wheel while the other rested on Daisy's head, her soft fur a comfort against the swirling thoughts in his mind. The warmth of the shelter still clung to him, but so did the weight of everything he'd experienced in the past 2 days. The woods felt darker on the way back, even with the rising sun casting pale light across the landscape. Every shadow seemed heavier, every gust of wind colder. Luke's muscles still ached from carrying the injured German Shepherd through miles of snow. His hands bore raw patches where the straps of his makeshift sled had bitten into his skin. But the physical toll was nothing compared to the quiet storm brewing inside him. He couldn't stop thinking about the dog. Chance. That's what Emma had decided to call it. "Because that's what you gave him," she'd said with a soft smile. The name fit. It wasn't just a name for the dog, it was a word that encapsulated the entire experience. The second chance. A chance to survive. A chance to fight. And yet, even with the happy ending they'd reached, Luke couldn't shake the sense of inadequacy that had clung to him throughout the ordeal. Every misstep, every moment of hesitation, had replayed in his mind over and over. He had saved the dog, yes, but it had been messy, chaotic. He'd been humiliated by his own limitations at every turn. Carl's biting words still echoed in his head, a reminder of how easily others dismissed the effort as foolish. But then there was the look in Chance's eyes before Luke had left the shelter. Not fear. Not pain. A quiet, unspoken gratitude. It had cut through all of Luke's self-doubt like a knife, leaving him raw but strangely whole. When he pulled into his driveway, the cabin looked different somehow, smaller than it had before. The quiet isolation that had once been his refuge now felt oppressive, as if the walls had been closing in all along, and he was only now noticing. Daisy hopped out of the truck as soon as he opened the door, bounding toward the cabin with her tail wagging. Luke followed slowly, his boots crunching over the frozen ground. The barn loomed in the distance, its weathered walls a reminder of where he'd first tried to save Chance. He stopped midway to the cabin, his gaze fixed on the barn door. It creaked softly in the wind, as if inviting him back inside to relive every agonizing moment of those hours spent patching up the dog. For a long time he just stood there, staring. The weight of everything he'd been through settled over him like the snow blanketing the ground. But instead of turning away, he took a deep breath and walked toward the barn. Inside, the air was colder than he remembered. The blankets were still in a messy pile where he'd left them, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering in the air. Luke crouched down and picked up one of the blood-stained scraps of fabric he'd used to bandage Chance's wounds. The sight of it made his chest tighten, but this time, it wasn't with humiliation. He had saved that dog. He'd been clumsy, he'd been scared, but he'd done it. And somewhere along the way, Chance had saved him too. That night, as Luke sat by the fire with Daisy curled up at his feet, he made a decision. He wasn't done yet. Chance wasn't the only animal out there fighting to survive, and Luke couldn't ignore that fact anymore. The next morning, he called Emma. "I want to help," he said, his voice steady but tinged with the same vulnerability he'd felt when he first walked into the shelter. "Volunteering or whatever you need. I want to do more." Emma didn't hesitate. "We could always use the help. And honestly, after what you did for Chance, I can't think of anyone better for the job." Luke smiled faintly, the warmth of her words breaking through the lingering chill in his chest. The first day at the shelter was overwhelming in ways Luke hadn't expected. The sounds of barking, meowing, and the occasional squeal of an excited animal filled the air, a stark contrast to the quiet of his cabin. There were rows of kennels, each one holding a creature with its own story of hardship. Some were injured, others malnourished, but all of them had that same look in their eyes that Chance had: hope, fragile but persistent. Emma walked him through the basics, her tone patient but firm. "It's not glamorous," she said, handing him a mop and bucket. "But it's important. These animals need clean spaces, fresh food, and someone to show them kindness. That's where we start." Luke nodded, rolling up his sleeves without hesitation. The work was exhausting, cleaning kennels, hauling bags of food, administering medications, but it felt right in a way nothing else ever had. Every small act, no matter how mundane, felt like a step toward something bigger. Daisy became a regular at the shelter too, her cheerful presence a comfort to the animals and staff alike. She seemed to sense when a scared dog or nervous cat needed a little extra attention, her gentle nudges and wagging tail working magic that even Luke couldn't replicate. As the weeks turned into months, Chance made a miraculous recovery. The wounds on his flank healed into faint scars, and his fractured leg grew strong again. Emma had been right. Chance was a fighter, and he wasn't going to let anything hold him back. Luke visited the shelter every day, watching as the dog he'd once carried through the snow transformed into a picture of strength and resilience. The bond between them was undeniable. Chance would perk up the moment Luke walked through the door, his tail wagging furiously as he bounded toward him. But as much as Luke cared for Chance, he knew the dog deserved more than a life in his cabin. Chance deserved a family, a home filled with warmth and love. One day, a young couple came into the shelter, their eyes lighting up the moment they saw Chance. They knelt by his kennel, their hands reaching out to stroke his fur as he wagged his tail and licked their fingers. "This is the one," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "He's perfect." Luke watched from a distance, his chest tight. It was bittersweet, seeing Chance connect with someone else. But it also felt right. The day Chance left the shelter was harder than Luke had anticipated. He knelt by the dog one last time, scratching behind his ears as Daisy sat patiently by his side. "You're gonna do great, buddy," Luke said softly, his voice trembling. "You've got a whole new life ahead of you. Don't waste it." Chance licked his face, his eyes filled with the same trust that had carried them through the storm. Luke stood and watched as the couple led him out the door, his heart heavy but full of pride. Life at the shelter became Luke's new normal. The work was still hard, still messy, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. Each animal that came through the doors reminded him of Chance and the journey they'd shared. The story of Chance spread quickly through the community, becoming a symbol of hope and courage. People came to the shelter not just to adopt, but to offer their time and support. Luke became known as the man who wouldn't give up, the one who saw value in even the most broken creatures. But to Luke, it wasn't about recognition. It was about the quiet moments, the wag of a tail, the purr of a cat, the feeling of knowing he'd made a difference. And in those moments, he realized that saving Chance hadn't just changed the dog's life. It had changed his own.